event, which has been organized by the Indian Council for Research in International Economic Relations. I'm very happy to welcome Mr. Charles Collyns, who's going to talk to us about the IMF evaluation system and how it adjusts IMF to adapt to new realities. I, of course, belong to a vintage of people where it was the opposite way. The new realities, the new countries had to adapt to the IMF, but it's probably changed now. And we are very happy also to have N.K. Singh, the chair of the Finance Commission, to preside over this. Montek Ahluwalia, who was, of course, the first head of the Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF, besides, of course, having been the deputy chairman here. Shaktikanta is there, and Prakash Lungani also from the IMF. I'm here because the chair of the board of ICRIER, Ahluwalia, cannot be there, so my function is simply to welcome you and look forward to listening to what our guest has to say and what Mr. Montek Ahluwalia and others would have to say about what happens there. So let me just stop here. If there is time, at the end of the evening, end of the morning, I'll say a few words. Thank you very much, and I invite Mr. N.K. Singh to take over and conduct the proceedings.
Thank you very much, Nitin. So I think that let's get straight to what we are supposed to do in the morning. This is the sequence in which we will go through today's morning's discussion. I'll first really request Charles, who requires no introduction. He is known to many of us here. He is the director of the Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF, and he's going to make a presentation to us. We are fortunate in having Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia, who was the first first person to head the Independent Evaluation Office. And after that, after he makes his presentation, I'm going to really request first Mr. Shaktikanta, who is a colleague of mine in the Finance Commission, and he's also currently the G20 Sherpa, and therefore brings an international perspective. Before he joined the Finance Commission, he was the Secretary for Economic Affairs, and therefore, in a certain sense, closely dealing with the work relating to the IMF and the World Bank. After Mr. Shaktikanta has made his observations, I'm going to request Mr. Montek Singh Ahluwalia to make his observations. And then, of course, depending on the interest, I'd be delighted to be able to promote questions and answers, and then, if time permits, make some final remarks. So with these, can I request you, Charles, to make your presentation?
Well, thanks so much, N.K. It's always a great pleasure to be back here in New Delhi. I was actually the IMF's resident representative back in 1993 and 94, and at a time when N.K. and Montek were both beavering away in the finance ministry with tremendous success, setting India on a path of growth and stability. And I think one of the fruits of those labors was that you haven't actually been back to the IMF in the last 25 years to borrow, and that hopefully the IMF has been able to draw on your wisdom, and well, particularly Montek, who was was the first director of the Independent Evaluation Office, and of course my thanks to ICRIER for hosting this event and providing this venue, and for bringing in a very distinguished audience. So it's a real opportunity for us in the Independent Evaluation Office, or IEO as we call it, to talk to you about how we see the role of independent evaluation at the fund, and how we believe it's really helping to strengthen the fund. Montek, if I can put it like this, is the father of a child which I think has grown up to be a really critical component of IMF governance, helping to contribute to the IMF's greater accountability, a greater ability to learn from its experience, and a more transparent organization that is more open to ideas from outside. So in these ways, I think independent evaluation really is helping to build a better, stronger, more effective IMF. In this presentation, I'm going to be sharing the podium with my friend and colleague Prakash Longani. Prakash will start off by outlining some of the challenges that the IMF has faced over the past 10, 15 years or so, as it's grappled with multitude of crises and changing global dynamics, and briefly describe how the fund has adapted to these changes. And then I will come back and talk about the role of the Independent Evaluation Office and how we assess the fund's activities and how we believe that the fund has changed and in what ways it's doing a better job than it has in the past, and what are the areas where we think there are continuing issues that we will continue to focus on as we go about our role in the years ahead. So let me stop there and pass the baton to Prakash, and then I'll come back later.
Thanks very much, Charles, and thanks to ICRIER for organizing such a wonderful event with distinguished panelists and a distinguished audience. I'm very pleased to be here. So as Charles said, I'll describe some of the changes that the IMF has made over the years to become a better institution. So, one way to tell that story is to think of the IMF as facing a series of crises and sort of learning from the experience of that crisis. So some of you will recognize who that person is, many may not. This is our former chief economist, Mike Musa. And I put his picture there because I remember very vividly Mike Musa saying many times, he used to say it in a booming voice, which I don't have, and he didn't have an Indian accent, so you have to imagine Mike saying this, but Mike always used to say, the IMF is very good at managing crises. Look how many we've managed to have. So, it was the kind of tradition at the IMF that something would happen. We would try to do our best, but some crisis would happen that we would not expect, and then we would have to say, well, why did we miss this one too? What can we learn from this? So that's one way of saying that every crisis has led to change. There has been embarrassment at missing the crisis. There has been criticism from the outside on how we have handled it, and then this has led to changes in the institution. But one can also sort of say that it's not just a story of crisis. There has been a lot of evolution in the global economy, and the IMF has changed along with these changes in the global economy. So, you can go back very far, and that would keep us from lunch. So let's start the story at what I think is a watershed event, which is the fall of the Soviet Union, which, sort of discredited central planning as a big way of organizing the economy. China and India opened up their economies and became more integrated and assumed a much bigger role in the global economy. The European Union expanded to let in Eastern Europe and the Baltic countries. So the result of all these developments was a vast expansion of trade, setting up of global supply chains. And then along with the expansion of trade, there was, I think, a fairly new development, which was the vast expansion of capital flows, what we call financial globalization. Okay? So I think that what happened was that as you had greater trade and capital flows, you sort of needed greater exchange rate flexibility. It was a good tool to be able to manage many of these changes. So if you look at the bottom line of all these changes that I have been describing, you see that the IMF, which was set up in a world where there was no free flow of capital, you had closed capital accounts, and the IMF was set up to manage a fixed exchange rate system. So it went from that kind of world to a world in which open capital accounts were open, and there was exchange rate flexibility. So a profound shift in the kind of world that the IMF had that it had to deal with, and so it really had to change in order to kind of deal with this multipolar, globalized world. Now, I think the changes that I have described that are summarized on this slide have led to vast benefits, the biggest of which is the great rise in living standards in the emerging markets and the consequent reduction in poverty. So I think we should not lose sight of these great benefits of an integrated, globalized world. But of course, it has not been a smooth process. There has been a lot of discontent. One source of discontent has been what I already described, which is that this process of moving to a globalized world, a multipolar world, has not been a smooth one. There have been these periodic crises. You had the emerging market crises, followed by the advanced economy crises more recently, leading you to wonder about what's coming next. But there have been two other processes in addition to these periodic crises. In the advanced economies, many are dealing with what is now being called secular stagnation, declining productivity, falling real interest rates, which for the emerging markets means that there is this surge for yield as money that cannot find enough returns in the advanced economies is coming around looking for yield elsewhere. There has also been something that has started to get a lot of attention, which I've called in some other work secular exclusion. So secular stagnation has got a lot of attention. I think secular exclusion should also get attention, which is the stagnant median incomes in many advanced economies, rising inequality in almost every advanced economy and in many emerging markets as well. A stalled process of income convergence where many countries in sub-Saharan Africa are just not catching up with the rest of the world. And then sort of global challenges that we are not fully facing up to, the problem of fragile and conflict-ridden states, the challenges of dealing with climate change. So in short, it has been a world that is very different from the world in which the IMF was set up. And of course, it has changed to take account of this changing world. So let me quickly describe what the changes that the IMF has instituted. And I'll describe those changes under 4 headings. 3 of them are the traditional functions of the IMF, which we call surveillance, kind of economic monitoring, lending, the programs that get us into the press, and then technical assistance, a kind of very vast activity, but often not much talked about. And so those are the 3 activities. And I'll also talk about the governance of the institution, which Charles already referred to, kind of the overarching framework under which the institution operates. Okay. So what has the IMF done to improve its surveillance, its economic monitoring? Some of the initial crises that I described, the Mexican tequila crisis, the Thai crisis, were partly because of a lack of transparency on the part of governments about some of their operations. So that led to really a transparency movement where the IMF started asking of its members more and more data. But in that process, the IMF realized that it itself had to be pretty open about what it was recommending and what policy advice it was giving. So it could not just be a one-way street of asking its member countries, you tell us more and more about what you're up to. The IMF itself had to reveal what its policy advice had been. So that led to a big revolution where IMF reports, which, as many of you know, are called Article 4 reports, our annual consultations, started being published. So now you have a lot of information about what the IMF actually advises countries. And then because crises were being missed so frequently, there was a lot of attempt to build up the toolkit through better forecasting attempts, through more assessment of risk and vulnerability, through looking at the impact of one crisis on other countries, so spillover and contagion effects. Second, because of the changing world that I described moving towards open capital accounts, greater exchange rate flexibility, the IMF had to obviously pay more attention to these external sector issues. The IMF now has a new report called the External Sector Report. So the IMF, as you may know, has 3 flagship publications: the World Economic Outlook, Global Financial Stability Report, and the Fiscal Monitor. So the external sector report is kind of joining that pantheon as almost a 4th flagship. And then, because many of these crises that I described were due to opening up the capital account somewhat prematurely or not in a kind of controlled way, the IMF has been forced to reevaluate its advice on capital account liberalization, and a few years ago issued an institutional view saying that yes, full capital accounts was still a desirable long-run goal, but there was no need to rush into it. It also kind of gave countries the flexibility to use capital controls when they were faced with some crises. With the opening up of capital accounts, with increased integration, the IMF has had to beef up its monitoring of financial markets, global financial markets. And here a new product is the Financial Sector Assessment Program, known as FSAP. And that has been a big part of how the IMF has gone around monitoring the financial sectors of various countries. And the last thing on this slide is the move away from what is sometimes called the Washington Consensus towards kind of a broader agenda, where the IMF worries about what's happening much more in labor markets, what's happening to inequality. Gender issues have become very prominent over the last 5-7 years, and climate change is becoming an increasing part of the IMF's activities. So I think of that as kind of a move from the Washington Consensus toward a new paradigm, which you might think of as inclusive growth. Okay. I'll be briefer on the rest of this. On lending, as financial markets have grown, the IMF has been able to increase its own lending capacity thanks to contributions from its member countries. This has allowed the IMF to make some very big loans to Korea during the Asian crisis, more recently to Greece. The IMF has been able to work with external partners to bring in both more money and extra surveillance. It has tried to provide insurance to countries. This is a program called FCL, Flexible Credit Line, as a way of providing insurance to countries when they are faced with spillovers or contagion. And to help sub-Saharan Africa and other states of that kind, it has been able to bring in more concessional financing and provide more help for natural disasters and post-conflict. Okay. Capacity building, as I said, is kind of the unheralded activity of the IMF. It takes up 1/3 of the IMF's budget and has changed in character a lot over the last few years. It brings in much more money now from external donors. There has been much more attempt to decentralize it by setting up regional technical assistance centers. Some of you may know of SARTAC in India. And again, there has been an attempt to beef up the IMF staff's financial expertise to keep up with the changing nature of global financial markets. Okay. And finally, on governance, there has been an attempt to recognize the increased role of emerging markets by shifting some of the quota from the advanced economies towards the emerging markets. There has been an attempt to bring in emerging markets into the governance of the institution. The G20 played a very big role during the global financial crisis, and that includes, as you know, the major emerging markets. And let me finish on this note. I think everything that I've said sounds wonderful. The IMF has done a lot, but it is all based on sort of self-assessment. And self-assessment tends to be very generous to oneself. So I think a critical part, as Charles said, of trying to really institutionalize the process of learning at the IMF has been the setting up of the Independent Evaluation Office, which Montek, as you have heard a couple of times now, was the first head of. So with that, let me turn it back to Charles to talk about not just what the IMF has done in its own view, but what external views of this effort have revealed. Thanks.
Well, thanks so much, Prakash. That was a rapid overview of a lot of change that has occurred at the fund over the past 20 years. And our role at the Independent Evaluation Office is to try to assess to what extent these changes have had the impact that was intended, and to try to help the fund to learn from its experience with change to make sure that it is achieving the impact that it desires and is achieving the most that it can. The IO was set up in 2001, shortly after the Asia crisis, one of Prakash's many crises, and really a crisis not just for the Asian region, but also it became a crisis for the IMF itself, a crisis of legitimacy and credibility. And at that point, it was decided that the fund really needed to set up on a permanent basis an internal capacity to evaluate what it was doing, to improve the accountability of the fund's actions, to increase the ability of the IMF's executive board to apply proper oversight over the activities of the fund's management and staff, to help the fund be more reflective of its performance. The fund is an institution with a lot of very smart people cooped up in one, now two buildings, and there's a tendency for self-reinforcement within the building, not enough listening to outsiders, not enough listening to internal voices that may come up with contrarian views. And the Independent Evaluation Office was given the task of providing a counterweight, a more objective, more thoughtful, more evidence-based way of challenging views within the fund and learning, and also helping the fund to be more open, to be more transparent, to improve the understanding outside the fund of what the fund was trying to do, but also to provide a channel for outside ears to come into the fund, so that the fund would be less of an echo chamber and more open to the full range of ideas being generated in the external environment. One important point to emphasize at the front is that although sometimes we're called the policeman's policeman, we're not really comfortable with that role or that nickname. We're different from the inspector general or watchdog or auditor that governments often have, which are assessing whether actions are consistent with given rules or legislation. Rather, we have a broader, more open mandate to think, how can we help the fund do better to achieve its very broad mandate as laid out in the Articles of Agreement? In fact, it's this that makes working at the IO a very exciting and fulfilling role. We're not just going around scolding people and trying to find faults, but rather trying to find ways to help the fund do even better. One key aspect that allows us to play this role is that we are truly independent. We're independent from management and from staff. We're not part of the staff. I was myself appointed by the executive board, and then it's up to me to appoint the staff of the IO and to select the topics that we cover. I have an arm's length relationship with the board. The board gives me the mandate. If they like, they can remove me, but they're not involved in the day-by-day operations of the office. Now, it's important, of course, for us in the IO to have a close relationship with the board, to understand what are the issues that concern the board, because in the end, the IO is only influential to the extent that we have the board with us, supporting the recommendations that we make. But in the end, we are independent of both management and the board in terms of the choices that we take. We have our own budget that's separate from the budget of the staff. We have access to virtually all information that's generated within the fund, with very limited exceptions. There is, this is an interesting aspect, an external evaluation of the independent evaluation office. This occurs every 5 years or so, and there's one, in fact, ongoing right now. And I think it's actually very useful to us. It provides a stock taking of how well we are ourselves doing, helps us to learn from our own experience. You know, no one is exempt from this need to continually to reflect on how to do better. And it's also an opportunity to reflect on the overall framework for evaluation and learning in the fund, to consider whether the overall framework in the fund within which we operate is one that's conducive to ensuring that we have the impact that we hope to have. One point I should emphasize up front is that we are actually a very small office. All the IFIs have evaluation offices. Most of them are much larger than we are. The World Bank's independent evaluation group is over 10 times as big as we are in dollar terms or in staff. But I think I like to claim that the IO is actually just as, maybe even more influential in the fund than these other evaluation groups are in their organizations. Because we're small, we're more strategic. We take on the key issues, and we have been able to attract the full attention of the board and hence management and staff for what we are doing. If we were larger, if we generated more reports, I think there would be a risk, at least, of saturating the market and losing the impact that we have by focusing on a few key topics. We have a pretty well-established evaluation cycle. I don't want to go into all the details here, but I think the key point is that we have a deliberative process. We are evidence-based. We look at the facts. We look at the internal documents. We look at the numbers, but we also bring in outside views, outside analysis. We spend a lot of time working with external consultants. We can't ourselves be experts in all the areas that we look at, so we really depend on bringing top-notch experts to work with us. And that always is, it's quite a challenging process, which itself takes some time. We produce our reports. We review them internally. We review them with the staff. We share the conclusions with some external experts to make sure that what we're saying resonates. So that when we come up with our final product, we really believe that it's a balanced, evidence-based review of the issue that gets presented to the board. But that, of course, is not and should not be the end of the process. We don't just write reports to produce a new volume for the bookcase. We really want to change the way the fund operates. So the follow-up process is really important. And this slide here just illustrates the process of follow-up. There's a board discussion of our evaluations. In that discussion, the board has basically to decide yes or no whether they support the various recommendations that we make in our evaluations. Each evaluation will conclude with 5 or 6 recommendations where we are looking for board support. Those recommendations that are supported by the board, are then sent to management and staff as board-endorsed recommendations, and management and staff then have 6 months to come up with an implementation plan, which is intended to be a concrete, time-bound set of actions by the staff to respond to our recommendations. That is also discussed by the board within 6 months. A year later, every year, in fact, we have an annual assessment by the Office of Internal Audit inside the fund of the progress that's being made in implementing the recommendations. That's a very important step in this process, and that provides another opportunity for the board to weigh in on whether management and staff are making adequate progress in advancing the various actions that have been committed to in the management implementation plan. There's then further reflection. We ourselves look at recurring issues, which are issues that tend to crop up time and again in our reports. I'll have a slide on those later. And then after 10 years, we do an update. We revisit a topic to see how much progress has been made and whether there's a need for further evaluation of the area. We also ourselves do outreach. This is an outreach event. We do outreach internally and we do outreach externally. Often the impact of our reports is greatly amplified if we find broad external support for our evaluation recommendations. So, for example, with our recent report on social protection, which I'll talk about in a moment, there was a very strong reaction from civil society around the world, endorsing the findings in the report and asking the fund to really advance work in dealing with the various concerns that we raised. It's also important to do internal outreach to make sure that the IMF staff is aware of our conclusions and our findings and incorporate them within their work. So, just briefly, this slide summarizes our recent evaluations. Last year we did this report on IMF and social protection. That was the first report I was myself directly involved with. Major report before that was on the IMF's role in the euro area crisis. And I'll talk briefly about these two reports because I think they're both interesting and both came up with I think, quite important findings. First, the IMF and its role in the euro area crisis. This was a very difficult report to do for a variety of reasons. First of all, of course, the numbers were huge. The amount of funding that was required was far in excess of what had been provided in previous IMF programs. There was a need to work with European partners, which was something that was quite challenging for the fund. And that raised various questions about even-handedness and transparency. Was the IMF doing favors for its large European shareholders that it wouldn't do, say, for emerging markets that may have come to the fund to borrow? So we thought it was an important evaluation to do, but actually there was some resistance within the fund to doing the evaluation, in part because there was a concern that we might be complicating the fund's role in its future programs with countries faced in the crisis, particularly Greece. One of the restrictions on our actions is that we should not interfere with current operations, and there was some concern that by doing this evaluation we might make it more complicated for the fund to be involved with Greece. It was also very sensitive because there was a lot of internal debates within the fund about what was the right approach to be taken. So bringing some of those internal debates to the surface was a quite sensitive topic. So the evaluation reached a broad set of findings, raised a whole series of concerns. A major concern, which is really a recurring issue, is the fact that the fund just isn't very good at flagging the build-up of tensions and risks that lead to crises. The fund did not anticipate the Asian financial crisis, it didn't anticipate the global financial crisis, and it didn't anticipate the euro area crisis. There were issues to do with decision-making. A lot of the critical decisions had to be made very quickly without going through the normal, careful, deliberative process by which IMF policies are changed. There were difficulties working with European partners. To some degree, it compromised the fund's normal agility in responding quickly to dealing with problems. There are problems with program design. There are problems with accountability and transparency. So, overall, of course, the program was successful, but it was a messy process, and we made a number of recommendations to improve the process going ahead. The reaction of management and board to the report was quite positive, and it essentially agreed that some corners had been cut during the process of putting together the programs. There was a commitment that in the future, policies should only be changed after more careful deliberation and full consultation. A couple of board papers have been prepared to lay out more carefully the various approaches to be taken when working with regional partners, when working with currency unions. And there's a greater commitment to accountability and transparency in terms of some of the internal processes, the reporting of information on informal board meetings, providing information to us ourselves. So all this work is ongoing, but I think the lessons from the crisis are being absorbed within the institution. Secondly, our most recent report on social protection, very different topic. This really follows from the changes that Prakash was noting about secular exclusion. And I think there was increasing recognition within the fund that the fund could not ignore these forces, that social tensions were potentially dangerous to political and macroeconomic stability, and therefore the fund had to grapple with the need to protect the vulnerable from crises, from secular changes. But this is a very difficult area for the fund because the fund does not have the deep levels of expertise that it has, for example, in monetary policy or fiscal policy or the balance of payments. So it had to work closely with partner institutions like the World Bank, other regional development banks, and the United Nations. And that itself was quite difficult. And there was certainly an image problem because the fund in the past has been seen as this heartless institution that is so focused on adjustment that it doesn't pay adequate attention to the impact of its policies. So there were a range of concerns that we looked at in the evaluation. The evaluation, I think, came up with overall a fairly positive finding that the fund genuinely has picked up its work in the area of social protection. We provide a whole range of case studies to show the fund in action, both in surveillance activities, but also lending activities, being much more aware of the social consequences of policy changes, of social and political stresses, and looking for ways to alleviate those stresses. At the same time, it has to be said that the work has been somewhat inconsistent and variable in depth, not always appreciating country circumstances. So our overall recommendation was that there needed to be a more consistent, more coherent approach, less idiosyncratic, less dependent on individual staff members. But also the fund, of course, has to continue to work very closely with partner institutions. Now, one positive piece of news was that working with the World Bank had actually been quite successful based on division of labor, with the fund playing the key role in terms of advocacy, in terms of persuading political leadership of the need for changes to provide more social protection, and then finding the social space, the fiscal space within the budget to do so, and then leaving the difficult design and implementation aspects to the World Bank. In terms of communication, we did find that there was still a gap. Certainly very strong efforts by the communication department to emphasize that the fund cared about the importance of social protection, but sometimes the rhetoric went beyond the reality, and there was a need for a closer convergence between the two. Again, I think there was a good appreciation for the evaluation. All our recommendations were endorsed by the executive board, supported by management. As I mentioned, we've got a lot of attention from civil society. The implementation plan was recently presented to the board. It's a strong implementation plan centered around developing a more coherent institutional view of what exactly is the fund's role in the area of social protection. So we're looking forward to that work going ahead over the next year or so. I think I'm beginning to run out of time, so I'll skip quickly because I want to give a chance for the other speakers and for you in the audience. This slide summarizes the results of these annual audits of the implementation of our recommendations. The overall message is that implementation is mixed. Some of the implementation measures are enacted in full, but others are not. And there's a debate going on. We certainly debate within ourselves, but this is something that the external panel is looking at, is whether the failure to move more quickly just reflects the difficulty of dealing with these topics, or whether there's a real need to further strengthen the follow-up process within the fund. So that's an ongoing issue which the external panel is going to be looking at. So this slide here basically summarizes a range of issues that we have identified over the years as recurring issues, which the fund, I think, has attempted to address, but we cannot conclude at this point that they've been systematically dealt with. As continuing problems of wishful thinking and groupthink, the fact that the fund has not proved to be a particularly effective early warning system. There's the problem of the lack of country knowledge. The fund faces a challenge. On the one hand, when fund teams come to a country like India, part of their value is about bringing knowledge from around the world of best practices, of how things are done elsewhere that can be helpful to India. But at the same time, it's very important for the fund to really understand the local context, and balancing those two is a big challenge. There's the issue of even-handedness that became particularly apparent in the reaction to the European programs. There's the issue of mission creep. The fund is stretching itself to take on all these new issues that Prakash mentioned, but at the same time, it also has to maintain a core capacity, a core competence in key areas of monetary policy, fiscal policy, and balance of payments. And how you balance those is again a big challenge. organizational silos. Actually, I think there's been quite good progress in increasing the degree of communication within the fund. And there's a more systematic institutional mechanisms to make sure that people do talk to each other. But even so, I mean, I think any large bureaucracy has a problem of silo behavior. And there's still an issue of the degree to which the board is able to exercise its oversight function. And part of the problem is it's not always easy to bring the board together to coalesce around a coherent guidance to the staff. This is going to be a challenge when the work continues on social protection, to come up with a coherent, systematic view of what the fund should be thinking about social protection. This slide, very briefly, goes over the findings of the external panels. There's been 2 so far. Both of them were broadly supportive of the work that had been done, but emphasized to the IO that we should make sure that we don't shy away from the tough topics, the sensitive topics, and to do more outreach, to pay more attention to impact, reinforcing the point that the true metric of our own success is whether we're able to change the institution. In terms of our own work program, we're just right now finishing a report on the IMF's role in fragile states. This one should be completed next month and published soon after that. We're also hard at work on 2 other evaluations, one on the fund's role in financial sector surveillance, and the other on the fund's advice on unconventional monetary policy, which actually Prakash is in charge. We're doing 2 updates, one on structural conditionality, one on the IMF's governance system, and then there is the external evaluation, which is being led by Donald Kaberuka, the former head of the African Development Bank. So I'll end there. Here are some suggested issues for discussion, but you should feel free to come up with your own thoughts and questions. But so the broad issues that we've tried to address, we would be interested to hear the views of the panelists and the audience. You know, how well has the fund changed? The fund has changed, to be sure, but how effective have these changes have been? What about the IMF's governance structure? I think there have been important changes, including the increasing role of the IO. But are these changes big enough to really give the fund greater traction, to address some of the legitimacy issues that have been raised in the past? One question is, is the role of India and other rapidly growing emerging markets in the fund rising commensurately with the increasing role of countries like India in the global economy? Question about ourselves: how can our own impact be enhanced? What can we do to be more effective in doing our own jobs? And finally, always interested to hear suggestions about topics for future evaluations. We do try to take on the issues which are the biggest challenges for the fund, and we really rely on hearing from the broader audience what are the concerns that you have as we develop our own work program. So let me stop there, hand back to NK, but very much looking forward to the discussion.
Thank you very much, Charles, and thanks, Prakash, for that great overview. And Charles, for many of your very incisive comments on some finished and a lot of unfinished agenda for the IEO. Now, we have 2 very distinguished and eminent panelists with us, or discussants, to make some observations, either connected with the presentations which have been made or on an issue which would be connected with the broad theme, which is the IMF's role and the role of the Independent Evaluation Office. So I think that, may I suggest that we take them not in the order in which they are. Each of the discussants, I would request them to make their observations in about 7 to 10 minutes, if that meets with their approval. And thereafter, of course, I see that a lot of knowledgeable people are here with us, and we would have a Q&A session. So can I then request Mr. Shaktikanta, the member of the 15th Finance Commission, and the G20 Sherpa to make his observations. Shakti.
Good morning to everybody. I'm extremely happy to participate in this outreach program arranged by ICRIER with the Independent Evaluation Office of the IMF. We had two very good presentations, very informative and very thought-provoking, and I think they have raised a number of questions and number of areas where I'm sure many of you have observations and comments which will be good and useful takeaways for the evaluation team. What I would like to mention here is that when we look at the role of the IMF, I mean, I'm not going far back. Let's look at the last 10 years or so, post 2008 financial crisis. I think in the last 10 years, one thing that is noticeable is that IMF, the multilateral role of IMF has become much more pronounced. It was there earlier, but I think post 2008, when IMF started working very closely with the G20, when G20 also became a very active and proactive forum of global leaders. IMF also became a part of that discussions and deliberations, and almost in every meeting IMF has been making presentations about the health of the global economy. So the multilateral character of IMF has become more pronounced post 2008, and that is a very positive trend, and that needs to be carried forward. IMF, apart from the usual Article 4 missions which they have, where they look at country-wise issues, I think it's very important to look at multilateral and global issues, especially to flag the emerging challenges and the threats to macroeconomic stability and financial stability. So in this context, I think the role of Independent Evaluation Office becomes much more important. I would not use the word of a watchdog, but I think it acts as a kind of an external, I can use the word external because it is autonomous in its functioning. And it can become an external sort of guiding instrument for the direction and to give a direction to the IMF policies. Now, in this context, when IMF has become much more of a multilateral body, I think, and especially in the context of the current signs of global recovery, but still we have the problem of secular growth, and still we have the problem of global recovery not having taken sufficiently deep roots, and the necessity to ensure that the global recovery is sustained and it is maintained in the coming years. I think in all this context, the IMF needs to become a much more robust and proactive organization that should act on the principle of the, what if I can use the word, the nudge theory, to the world community, to G20 and to individual countries to take policy actions, global policy actions as well as national policy actions. Sometimes the IMF is seen in many parts of the world, in many discussions, as interfering beyond a particular limit, and then you have domestic political narrative, which often sort of tries to this becomes the IMF role becomes a part of the domestic political narrative and contentious discussions. So in a very careful manner, the IMF needs to nudge policy actions at the multilateral level as well as by individual countries. I would just mention, I think, 3 areas where the IMF currently needs to focus. Many of these areas have been listed, but I shall be brief. And there are 3 areas where I think the IMF now needs to focus, and I think the Independent Evaluation Office also perhaps may look at these aspects. The first is the need for governance reforms in the IMF. Now, a professional body, howsoever professional it is, will always be, somewhere at the back of the mind, and somewhere the structure of the IMF, the voice in the IMF board, the structure of the shareholding pattern of IMF, willy-nilly will definitely get reflected in the policy actions that the IMF takes. It's like a board of directors where the promoter has a majority share, and you have independent directors, you have other professional directors, but the promoter invariably has a major say, and that is the reality of the world. Let's accept it. In the context of emerging countries today, having a greater share and an increasing share of global GDP and having an increasing role in world trade, IMF governance structure, the voice in IMF, I think, should represent the current world. And in this context, the general review of quotas, GRQ 15, becomes very important. It should have been done by 2015. Now it is, I think, postponed to the annual meeting of 2019. And there is an apprehension that that milestone may get further pushed. Now, that should not happen. So therefore, the first thing that needs to be worked upon is how to ensure that there is governance reforms within the IMF to reflect today's world reality. The second aspect which needs to be focused on, and which was mentioned by Charles, is that the inability of the organization to forecast crisis. It's very difficult. I mean, it's easy to say that you should have anticipated this difficulty, but all of us who work in various fields, we know how difficult it is to anticipate crisis. But then there are trends which one should be able to read, and at least the effort needs to be, there has to be maximum effort in this direction to forecast emerging challenges to the global economy, emerging crises. In this context, I would like to highlight one particular trend which we find over the last 1 or 2 years, which is now becoming, very well felt. And I think this poses, perhaps, according to me, in my view, one of the biggest challenges, or should I say threats to global macroeconomic stability and financial stability, is the rise of this whole thing of cryptocurrencies. Without any underlying asset, a kind of a value is created and it is traded, and overnight there is fall in value. So these are basically, these are potential Ponzi schemes, and this will, this is likely to sort of, all experts, I mean, I have been reading various journals and magazines. There are a large number of experts who have sufficiently warned the world community that this bubble is likely to burst anytime. And it's very heartening to note that the Finance Minister of India, in his budget speech this year, has also flagged his serious concerns on this issue. So whatever policy action through the instrumentality of FATF tried to curb terror financing, whatever policy actions countries have taken to curb money laundering through various policy actions, and whatever action has been taken by countries to control Ponzi schemes and to prevent nurturing and growth of this kind of bubbles, can these today's cryptocurrencies have a potential to undo that, and this requires global consensus, global policy action. We need to, of course, segregate the positive aspects of the blockchain and technology, the algorithms. They have definitely a positive role to play. So this could be the second area where IMF, I would feel, needs to give attention. And the third is this whole issue of debt to GDP matrix, of not only at the global level, not only at the individual country level, but at the global level. The global GDP versus the global debt. And are we in the right direction? And especially in the context of the exclusion, the rising inequality between regions and the rising inequality within regions, I think it has become very important to look at this whole issue of debt to GDP metrics for the world economy and work on possible, take cues from possible challenges and the emerging threats in this area. And it's only an institution like the IMF which can work on this, and IMF also in this area perhaps should not only work with various countries but also with the other development financing institutions like the World Bank and others, and to see